2 minutes.
Okay,
Yeah,
also.
no, I need everything too. I was feeding a couple animals. Like, that's another swing.
Okay.
That's why it's open to come back when we get time. So. Well,
Okay, at this time, I would like to have Hannah and Kaylee join us to introduce our last speaker of the day.
Good afternoon. My name is Hannah Otley, and I am one of the students from the University of Findlay that's helping run the conference this weekend. We are so happy that you all could join us. Based in Brooklyn, New York, Nina Cruz is the daughter of author-illustrators Donald Cruz and Ann Jonas. Her work has been recognized by many, including the ALA Notable Committee, Cooperative Children's Book Council, Junior Library Guilds, Bank Street College of Education, and National Council of Teachers of English, just to name a few. She has been an author-illustrator since 1995 when her first book, One Hot Summer Day, was published. In February of 2020, her most recent book was published, A Girl Like Me, which was written by Angela Johnson. When looking through Nina's amazing work, I really loved the style in which she chose to illustrate them. Nina uses a collage style and incorporates photographs in her illustrations, which is a very unique illustrating style. I love that when reading her books to students, this encourages them to make real-world connections to what they're reading and seeing. We are so excited to have Nina here today to share with us.
Nina, could I have you unmute?
All right, hello. This has been such a beautiful, wonderful conference. I listened last night and all day today, and so I guess I got into audience mode a little bit here. But thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Ben, for inviting me to be a part of this year's MAZA conference. It has been really terrific. I do wish, as everybody has said, that we were all together in person, but still getting that opportunity to hear other people talk about their work, to hear all the other illustrators talk about their work and their process, their author illustrators, has been really lovely. And it's something that I think, I don't know, I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I think I've heard it from others, that we all really enjoy getting a sense of, you know, making connections to the processes of how they do their work and how I do mine. And I think ultimately we'll always find that there's a lot of sort of overlap and synthesis of things that we do in sort of ways in which we do the different pieces, but in fact, what we create often is so very different. And that's really one of the most exciting things about it. So let's see, I'm going to share my screen and get started here. So let's go. So I have now worked on about 15 books so far. As mentioned, I started with my first book, One Hot Summer Day. For the most part, I've been working as an author illustrator, though I've also had projects given to me that I've just done the illustrations for, and developed some of the projects, and I'm going to talk about that quite a bit, projects where I took found the material that we then developed into a book. So instead of editor coming to me with a manuscript, I've found text, poems, and things that we've then turned into books, worked with editors at publishers to turn into books. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about that as I go on. Yes, One Hot Summer Day was the beginning back in 1995. But my real beginnings start back here. And as was mentioned, my parents, Donald Cruz and Ann Jonas, were also children's book authors and illustrators. Mostly as a young kid, they were graphic designers, however. And this is me over here on the left, and my sister Amy, who's a year younger, on the right, in our bedroom and our, home studio. My father had done a couple of books that were in print, written and illustrated when I was a kid. So a couple of them were ones that I grew up with as from an early reader age, like We Read Alpha A to Z and 10 Black Dots. But really his career sort of flourished when he did Freight Train. And that was, I was a teenager by then, and Freight Train, Truck. These are just a few of his. Carousel, Harbor were all kind of part of my sort of developing as a teenager into my college years, and as a young person finding out who and what I would be, what I would do with my life. But you know, to go back in terms of talking about being the studio in our house, my parents worked in our home always. They always had their studio in our home, and here are some of my mother's books. Color Dance, Round Trip, the black and white one here, When You Were a Baby, and The Quilt. And so we always grew up around the idea that art materials were always there, available for us to use. My parents were always working, making things, creating things, and art projects were also part of our family life. So, you know, we would make Christmas cards together. When my mother would give me stuff, and me and my best friend would make paper dolls by, you know, our own paper dolls by hand, and cut them out and create little boxes of stuff if we wanted to, you know, have a house for they made a doll house for us when we were kids, and I made a doll house for my favorite troll. You know, so those things were all part of our family life, a life of always creating stuff and making stuff.
Nina?
We had books. We didn't have the number.
Nina,
Sorry,
I just wanted to, if you could go back one slide. The Maz Museum has a work from your mother's book, The Quilt, and then we also have some works by your father as well. I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, yes, I'm glad you did mention that. And I did know that my parents had donated some work to the Maza before, so that's fantastic. Yeah, and I'll mention also about the quilt. You'll notice the girl here looks quite a bit like, let's go back here, this girl here with the braids and the very sort of fluffy, loose hair at the top. So my father took this photograph and took lots of photographs of me and my sister, and many of those photographs were reference material for my mother as she worked on some of her books, in particular this book, and also in color dance, because we both did dance class when we were kids too. So our home life, you know, we had, you know, the classics, Dr. Seuss and Wanda Gag. What happened here? Oh, there we go, missed slide. Some of the books that really meant a lot to me were books like this. There's at the top here is Ellen Raskin's Nothing Ever Happens on My Block, Little Bear by Elsa Holm Minigrick and illustrated by Maurice Sendak, Anne and Harlan Rockwell's Sally's Caterpillar, and A Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats. And I kind of highlight these 4 books here because they all, I feel like, really kind of added to my sense of what's important in children's books. Obviously, and I can talk a little bit about this too, what my parents did, I think, had a big influence on how I looked at what a book was when I decided to enter the business. But also these books kind of tell the kind of stories that sort of made sense to me and what I thought a children's book really should be. And so just to start with the one at the top, Nothing Ever Happens on My Block, you know, we have basically the street, and all the action takes place on the street. And growing up in New York City, that is, you grow up in a busy city, congested city like New York, the action does take place on the street, or a lot of action takes place on the street. So that's sort of an active place of the imagination, and of story is always outside. So that's one of the reasons why that book is so meaningful to me. I always have loved the sort of the idea in Sally's Caterpillar, the girl goes on vacation and comes back and brings her the caterpillar back home with her. But just a simply told story and a kind of direct language and sort of opening up the space to the child's experience is something else that's really important to me. And Little Bear, again, a child-centered story, even though our child is a bear here, the story and the language of the bear and his relationship to his friends, to his parents, all felt very much like, you know, childhood. And A Snowy Day almost needs no explanation. I feel like it is the sort of book for so many of us in the business. But you know, it was one of the few books in my childhood, of course, that had starred a child, brown-skinned boy. He lived in the city. He had all this independence, which I loved, particularly as the older sibling, this idea that you could kind of strike out on your own. And there were just so many layers in which that story has been always a sort of a text to go back to in my mind. So growing up with the parents having their art studio in our house, art studio was always important to me. And, you know, it was nice. We'd go and we needed to do a project and there would be glue, and we wanted some colored pencils, there would be colored pencils. We had our own stuff given to us on a regular basis too to use, but there were always sharp scissors, and there were all sorts of funny things that they used that sometimes we would get to handle that, you know, you wouldn't get usually at 7 or 8 or 9, which were things like there was something called letters that press on type. This was, you know, before people were using computers at home. So you could take, you know, and do a nice, beautifully neat letter could be placed onto a piece of paper because it was a sort of thin adhesive plastic that you lay down on stuff, all sorts of things. So anyway, tools were always something that I liked to think about. And this is a drawing I did of some of my working tools. And aside from at home, I also got to use a lot of tools, both in, you know, good art programs in my elementary school. And then I went to a New York City magnet high school where I was also had 2 classes a day, every day of art. So we were always doing printmaking and sculpture and painting and all sorts of things there. And so by the time I actually even got to college, I had a real sense of at least materials to some degree. So stepping aside from tools, I just thought I'd also mention time. And I was just reading something in the New Yorker not too long ago, and the writer was talking about his punk days as a young person and coming up. And you know, time passes and you forget that there are certain things in the time that you're in that affect kind of who you decide you are and what you decide is important to you. And so here's just a little collage of some of the things that, particularly after I finished college and right in those first years of figuring out exactly what it was I was doing. So I knew I wanted to make art, and I had ideas of things that I was doing, but what led me to making the choices that I made in terms of the way I created the art that I created, right? So those are kind of like some of the things that were in the background of those decisions. So we have a here mixture of music and art. Music being, this was the early days of hip hop, so Salt and Pepper and De La Soul. It was also the new wave days of music, like from a lot of music from England, like a group called Squeeze and stuff. And it was also, so those were kind of some of the things that I was looking at, and visually it was appealing to me in the same way that some of the art of the time was appealing to me, in that there was a use of sort of a lot of collage, bright colors, a kind of mixture of handmade and photographic, were all things that were kind of part of the stuff that I was looking at. And then from the art side, we have here, this is an artist, Barbara Kruger, who did these always black and white pictures with red accents to it, and wrote things and kind of responded to existing photographs. We have, this is a artist from the 20s, German artist from the 20s in Hannah Hawk, who did these very wonderful collages using found images. Romeo Bearden, African-American artist, both painter and collage artist. And then a couple of photographers of photographs of New York City. This is a Danny Lyons photograph of the subway way back in probably the late 70s. And this is by Helen Levitt in the Lower East Side, children near a gumball machine. So those are just sort of some of the things visually that were behind what I was thinking about as I was starting to create my own work. And here's sort of some of the results of that thinking. So I loved going to Coney Island out in Brooklyn and taking photographs out there. So some photographs of children in that location. This is down in North Carolina. This is over in out in, when I went to Mexico one year. And then in New York City, and again, back to kind of early hip hop, was this was along Canal Street in Manhattan. There's a neighborhood. There were just loads of stores that would sell all the gold jewelry that people in those days, the hip hop stars were and friends were wearing. So just sort of all these big gold, goofy gold jewelry and stuff. And I also started taking the images that I made and manipulating them more. Again, looking at collage. So here we have one big photograph taken in Coney Island, cut and pasted and sort of photographed and printed a few times. So I had extra pieces of it. And then those pieces are, turned on their side, and some of them are printed a little lighter or darker, and kind of, instead of it being just a photograph of a young man sitting in front of the roller coaster, you have all these sort of pieces sort of breaking apart in more of a panorama. And back here is an illustration I did for an editorial for a magazine. And for that, I worked in the darkroom, making sort of a combination of several different photographs together, photographs I took around in the city at night, and layering those photographs together and then dribbling ink on top of it. And this was done as a shadow box using a color photograph with other pieces. And the pieces are, and then there's some pieces of brass stuck on top of the photograph, and it's all sort of layered levels of stuff to kind of create the collage there. That was all work I was doing, which was personal work. It was work I was not, well, actually the editorial I did make a little bit of money on. I was not really, making a lot of money from it. And that was not really how I was paying my rent. I guess in short, I was not paying my rent from the work you just saw there, but what I was doing was working in animation studios. And when I finished college, I thought, well, I really wanted to be in film. And I thought that was the place that you should be. That was where people were talking visually in a way that was really interesting. What I found quickly was that I did not like working in film, and found myself, I fell into a place in animation where I actually found this community of people who were doing, again, interesting work, usually not as much for most of our projects were quite bland and commercial, but were interesting artists and creators. And that was a way to pay the rent. I did get to do a few projects that I thought were kind of fun, and these are a few of them. At the very back here is a little short animation. I did a cutout animation. So cutout animation works in that you, instead of having cells, which probably some of you have seen, where you have a drawing that is photographed, filmed, and then replaced with another one, and you keep doing sequentially replacing each film to show the movement that way on the cells. With cutout animation, you just move stuff around. So you have everything laid out under the camera, and you move something, click the shutter, move things again, click the shutter, move things again, click again. And that's what I actually felt very comfortable with. And it fits again with collage and montage. And so this first one is a pinball machine where there's cockroaches living in it. And that was done for a pilot for a TV show that didn't get off the air, but it was a very fun project to work on. And it was developed by Spike Lee's siblings, two of his siblings, his sister Joie and his brother Sankey. And anyway, we had it was a great project to work on, didn't become anything. This bigger one down here is from a science informational thing that I worked on. And then this third is from a video for an artist named Billy Ocean that a friend of mine was putting together. So again, collage montage. And really it was with all of these kinds of things that I actually went and had my first meeting about doing a children's book, this and the photography work. And it was really one of those things that came to me. I've in listening to people talk about their work here and other times, it's very clear to me that so many people have gone through many years of knocking on doors and really working hard to get to those meetings. For me, I came to children's books a little bit hesitantly. My parents were doing this, had these amazing careers in children's books, and that was their thing. Right. And I thought, well, that's their thing, not necessarily my thing, but, I absolutely loved it. I did have before starting college, I did spend a month in the summer interning with their publisher, with Green Willow. So I actually not only had my understanding of the business through their work, but also through having spent some time with the people at Green Willow, with Susan Hirschman, with her art director, Ava Weiss, and really getting my hands into a little bit more of the business. So I had a sense of what was involved a bit with books. And then really, by the time I was working on these other projects I'm showing you, I've also made friends with quite a few other people who had a great interest in doing books, and were starting to do picture books. So when this opportunity came, it was really at a time when I was receptive to the thought that maybe I could enter children's books as well. And with a sort of a confidence that I actually had something that I would do that would be really truly mine and not, say, my parents. So the opportunity was this. My father has a manuscript that Susan Hirschman has given him, and he's not interested in illustrating it. And he told Susan, he says, well, why don't you talk to Nina? And he says to me, Nina, why don't you talk to Susan? And so I called Susan up and said, could we have a meeting? And this was, again, a long time ago. I think these days, probably you would send an editor a bunch of images, and they'd look through your Instagram feed, and they'd look through your website and all these other and everything else. But back in this time, I had my portfolio box. I brought it into our office. I sat with Susan and with Ava Weiss and showed them all my work. And they said, Nina, we like your work a lot. This is lovely, but we don't want you to illustrate this book. So I was like, oh, okay. And they said, well, their argument was that the writer, was a new writer, and I would be a new illustrator, and they didn't think it was the right fit. And that is something that is very much part of the job that an editor does and an art director does, is really kind of decide on the right fit for a project. And so, books rarely go together where the two individuals, an illustrator and an author, are separate people who come together and bring a project into a publisher. But usually it's an editor in the middle, kind of trying to figure out the best way to create a product that they think will do well. So they said, well, why don't you do this? Do you have any ideas of your own? And I kind of said, well, sort of, ideas that were half finished in the drawer. They said, well, why don't you come back next month? So I went home and I wrote, and I spent, the whole month thinking, well, let me give this a shot. And I wrote One Hot Summer Day. At the time, it was called Summer. I created a very small dummy. This piece here, this was the sketch that I brought in. It was about 3 inches by 3 inches. I used photographs, some that I had around, other things from, magazines and from the picture collection at the New York Public Library. Xeroxed it all, smashed it together and brought it in. And they said, yes. And so that really kind of began my career. And in this book, what I wanted to do was I really wanted to show kind of what I loved about my New York childhood, what New York, really kind of, what that experience was. I had at this point met and defended my city, my urban existence, to many people, many friends that had grown up in other places, both in college and after college while working with friends. And I thought, well, I'm going to do a book that sort of sings to what is, to me, a beautiful place to be. And I photographed things that I loved about New York City, like murals and stuff. And then I also photographed this young girl, Joy, who was 3 years old at the time. She's my cousin, and she had the kind of energy and spirit that I just loved. And so I talked to her family, and they said yes, and we agreed, and I photographed her for the book. So the story is very simple. It's a simple concept book. It's summer and it's hot, few words. Collage, hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk? Well, maybe not. So this background here you see is actually a bunch of pieces of the sidewalk, all kind of cut and pasted back together again. And then later in the story, she dances in the rain. Working in animation, I was often working, aside from my pieces were very often made with cut out, but there was lots of, I worked on lots of projects in cell animation. So I was always working with these layers of movement together. And I kind of brought that into this art, into this book, this idea of these layers of movement happening across one background. And then, and that was the beginning, the first. And I'm very proud to say that the book is still in print after now 26 years, and will be coming out in paperback by Green Willow next year. That's very nice and exciting to me. And so that's kind of where it began. As I said, at the beginning, showing the books that I love, children have really kind of been at the center of the story of a lot of the books that I've worked on. Really kind of, that's something, again, sort of, whether it's sort of an individual sort of moment kind of going through an experience in, say, I'll Catch the Moon or Below, or kind of something that's more about kids together, children at play, kind of things that they imagine, and using collage to kind of express sort of imagined spaces and fantasy spaces has all been part of much of the work that I've done. And because I'm using photography, it's photographing family and friends and friends of friends for all of the pictures in the books. So I'm going to just briefly go here just to say, I've shown you a lot about the photography, but as I start, I think the way most everybody else we've heard from this weekend has said, I start with pencil and paper. And for me, I actually start usually writing pencil and paper because that's kind of how I understand how to think and I feel like, I have an iPad and I have a Wacom tablet, but the lines move too fast and it's too slick. I like the way, that feeling of the surface of a piece of paper, and I feel very relaxed when I'm sitting at my desk. Drawing is a very relaxing space, and I feel like there's a good head to brain connection, hand to brain connection that happens, and is very opening to have that going. So I always start there. So this is from Below, this sketch. This is back here is from Snowball, and this is from The Neighborhood Mother Goose. When I began, as I mentioned, I began really pre-computer, or at least computers were around. This was, 95, but I certainly didn't own it. I started in 93. I didn't really own a computer, and certainly the photography, digital photography at that point was really had really only applications, say, in advertising, and the cameras were very slow if you wanted to have good quality, and anything else that was a faster, more immediate camera to use in a handheld way, the way I worked, was very low quality. So there really wasn't an option but to do what I was familiar with, which was taking my photographs and making prints and working with those prints and manipulating those prints. So that's how I began with, so here's my favorite tool of the time, which was an X-Acto blade, a very sharp little knife, and a cutting board. So here you see I took the photograph of Joy and cut and pasted it again into this background, similar space, but the color has been changed quite a bit on the sidewalk to make it this very sort of indigo blue color. And then these leaves are added as a separate piece. So I could do all the manipulations I wanted and kind of give the sort of less realistic, more emotionally sort of rich sort of space by using collage in the book. Then, of course, the computer's caught up to everything. And this was not the first book I did using the computer, but here we have a page from The Neighborhood Mother Goose. I used Photoshop, and even though we're working in a very different manner, working digitally, in Photoshop, you create layers. And this is actually a very old edition of Photoshop. This is my one old computer. But anyway, each layer works in the same way that, I was used to working, in that you have your different elements and you figure out how you want to manipulate them and use them, whether you make them different sizes and what you show and you don't show, and you layer and overlap. Now doing that digitally. So it's a different tool, but it actually also was one that felt I was very sort of a pretty seamless move over to, in that sense that, you're still working with your materials in a similar fashion. and they don't blow away, and you don't have to protect them from the cat climbing up onto the furniture and shifting all your stuff while you go get a cup of coffee and all that kind of stuff. So there's advantages. So I want to talk a little bit about, sort of the concept behind a few of the books and pulling those things together. And so poetry and song. So I just mentioned The Neighborhood Mother Goose, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So that book really came from a meeting that I had with Andrea Davis Pinkney, and we had a lovely meeting back when she was had her imprint at Jump at the Sun back at Disney Hyperion. And she said, well, let's talk about doing some work together. And I was like, yeah, let's talk about doing some work together. And we just sort of chatted about a bunch of different things, and I left. And then she called me later and said, well, what about Mother Goose? And as soon as she said it, I was like, it just seemed absolutely right. The idea of taking nursery rhymes, and she said, giving them the Nina Cruz style, Nina Cruz touch. And I was like, well, that would be kind of not only a fun challenge, but just sort of, yeah, I said, yes. And so, to begin, what I kind of did was look at every Mother Goose rhyme, poem, song I could find, and kind of start pull together a list of the ones that I liked and a working collection of ones that I thought I could also give that Nina Cruz spin to. And in that, it would be photographed in an urban setting. It would involve children, and that was basically it. What I found and what I discovered in working on finding the rhymes was that the range of what Mother Goose was even broader than I really realized before starting it. And I sort of thought, oh, well, look at this, that there's all this sort of room for very different emotions happening. There's the nonsense rhymes. There's the ones that are just sort of real observational stories. And so as I pulled together my list of favorites, I kept looking through and finding sort of different ones that kind of fill different niches, different boxes. So that was really a kind of a fun discovery, just to see sort of how much I could put into the book once I had this sort of working list of rhymes and songs. And here are a few pages from The Neighborhood Mother Goose, the one I just showed you on the computer, but here it is as a finished image. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. And we have, a lovely red fence. The neighborhood is Park Slope in Brooklyn. My friend's dog Olive, my cat Clementine, and my another cousin's son Isaiah in this picture. And here, I had been and done other things, particularly using collage. It's always one of the things that is done very often is to play with scale. So here, played with scale and used sort of these sort of created sort of worked in the sort of the nonsense rhyme version sort of mode of nursery rhymes. And so our little Miss Muffet is incredibly small. And also I thought it would be nice to sort of think about the fact that a spider is both small and also quite large at the same time. It's all about relative scale of things to each other. And so we have the Itsy Bitsy Spider and Little Miss Muffet on this page. And this, again, these are all put together as collages in Photoshop. So we have the spider, Josie, who's sitting there, and as separate images, holding her bowl of a mix of yogurt and cottage cheese and various other milk products for my curds and whey approximation. And here we have two boys, Alan and Jonathan, and to give this the city touch, I had the egg carton there on the frame because I wanted to really make sure that we thought, well, you don't just walk around with eggs, or you don't just find eggs anywhere. You get them from the supermarket. So just sort of keeping, the logic of the moment into my pictures, and that's something that I think as creators you're always trying to do is you kind of come up with a sort of sense of logic to what your story is, and recognizing that usually there's often a lot of things that are completely outside of that logic, but as long as you kind of have like sort of a framework you're happy with, you kind of keep going forward with your images and stuff. And here, this one again, using this as just sort of a moment to just sort of share that a moment of childhood fun, which, you know, I remembered enjoying so much too, just doing Ring Around the Rosie. They are these three. Here's Josie again, Traeger, and I am spacing on her name, and her name at the moment, Ayana is her name. I can't remember hers. Anyway, here in Neighborhood Park, Prospect Park, and one of my sort of most favorite places in New York City. And that's one of the fun things too about, you know, working with within these books. I'm always looking at some of my favorite spaces to feature into the pictures. Next one. Hello. Oopsie, there we go. Sorry, my computer's lagging a little bit. One thing I recognized after working on The Neighborhood Mother Goose was that, and reading it with kids, was that there was a lot of fun to be had singing with children. So I started, I did the neighborhood sing along because this was an opportunity to do more songs and have more singing. So this one, I'm just going to show a couple of these. Sorry. Here we have the Wheels on the Bus, back to a city bus scene, and Yankee Doodle Dandy. And just, it's a nice, boisterous, kind of fun song. So I thought, you know, share it and show it as if it was, you know, 4th of July in the city. All right, so I want to move up to some more recent books. The most recent books I've done, A Girl Like Me, I'll get to, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about Seeing Into Tomorrow, Haiku by Richard Wright. So when I both the Neighborhood Mother Goose and the Neighborhood Sing Along, I had the pleasure of kind of being the person to kind of curate the material, right? So while I was not the author, I was the editor. I was kind of curating what the choices were of what would go into it. So I was telling the story, such as it is, by collecting these different rhymes and songs, right? So that was kind of how I pulled those together. And it was something that, you know, it seemed to be a nice fit for the way I was working, because I felt that from a business perspective, that people liked the idea that there was something that was known that they could hang on to while having a book that was photography for kids. Because quite frankly, and I think I missed a slide, you know, there aren't a lot of photographers working in picture books. Most of it is nonfiction, which is great. And there's fantastic work done that is nonfiction for kids using photography, but there are just a few that are done as fiction, like I've been doing. And so it's always been a little bit of an anomaly. So I always finding that the existing materials, somebody else's poem, in particular the Mother Goose poems, was sort of this place where the two fit together in a nice way. So it was that these were, you know, gave people something that felt familiar and sure with the sort of art that was a little bit surprising. Anyway, I realized I didn't ask about questions. Do we have a question right now? Should I stop for a sec?
Yeah, and we'll start you off easy. Do you have a cat?
I do have a cat. Well, do you hear my cat right now? Because she's in the background complaining. She's we let her out into, we have a backyard, and we let her out into the yard, and she's very vocal. She's a tuxedo cat, and she cannot, she's a princess, and she's going to complain until I let her back outside, but I'm going to ignore her. So yeah. All right. So I'll carry on. So Haiku by Richard Wright. So I was thinking, knowing that this was a possible sort of way to move forward with my next project using some existing writing, existing poetry, I started thinking about what could I work with. And one of the things I looked at was this book here that I'd had kicking around for many, many years. You know, if you live in the city you grew up in and your parents hold on to stuff and had enough room in the basement to keep things, the books you always had are always there. So anyway, I still had, this book, and I was looking through it and trying to flag, maybe thinking that it would be interesting to think about bringing forward some poems by African-American writers in a picture book for kids. And one of the things I came across in this book were 6 of Richard Wright's haiku poems. Now, Richard Wright is the novelist of Native Son, Black Boy, The Outsider, many others. He wrote about 3,000 haiku in the last 18 months of his life. He was living in France, in Paris and in the countryside of France, and he was had in ill health, wasn't doing very well. And, he hadn't gotten anything. He sent stuff to his agent, nothing was selling. He was just sort of like a little bit, I think, probably in the dumps a bit. And his mother had died recently. So he starts writing these haiku poems, they're very simple, very short, 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, the third line has 5. That's the rule. The other general rule is that they be about nature. So he starts writing them, and it was something that people go back and forth and kind of so they've come from Japan, haiku, but as far as it's been something that European and American writers have looked to over throughout the 20th century, come back to various people. I think E. Cummings and Ezra Pound, all sorts of people, they always come back to them. So he starts writing haiku. He took about 800 of them and he sent them to his agent. And in 1998, volume of them, Haiku, This Other World, was published. This is the first edition. This is a more recent edition, but they got published many years after he died. He died in 1960. So I think, okay, well, this is interesting. So I get the book of all the haiku, and I start reading through them, and I tell my agent about the idea, and she reaches out to Richard Wright's estate, and they quote us a very reasonable price to possibly use the haiku in a book. So I thought, great. So that's the beginning of my thinking about this project. As it turned out, I thought about it and tried to figure it out for years. I think the first conversation was in 2006. And then it was in 2008 or 9, I think, that I did one dummy and I did a second dummy in 2008, I guess, 2009. And then finally, and we started showing it around to people. And actually, no, that's later, 2012. Excuse me, I sat on it for a bunch of years, 2012, 2013. And then finally got somebody interested, Regina Griffin, who was at Egmont, and she said she was, and she took it, had a contract, everything was moving forward. Then the publisher shut down because Egmont, who's a European house, decided they weren't going to have an American division any longer. So they shut down. So then I had to resell it, and we sold it to Lerner, and then it was published. So it was a very, very long journey, this book. But what I found is that sometimes that happens. The Neighborhood Mother Goose began with Andrea Davis Pinkney, but moved to Green Willow, again, because things happen and things change. But, what I've learned is that, that's just the way it is, because part of what we are doing, as much as we as creators see it as, love it as art and as something that we invest a lot of emotion and intellect into, it also is part of a business. And so there you go, that's life. So anyway, so here, and another couple of things just in terms of why this project attracted me so much. As I was working on looking through the poems, I also read Black Boy, and I saw that in the beginning of Black Boy, he talks about his experience as a young kid and his memories of being a young boy in the South, in Mississippi, and just sort of his experiencing nature. And it hit me that his haiku really are almost like extensions of that same sort of moment, which was very thoughtful and meditative and very much in contact with the natural world, with the green around us. I also, at that time, one of the things that started attracting me was this idea that I could talk about and show, Black boys in a natural setting, Black children in a natural setting, not in an urban setting. And while my experience, personal experience and love has been, growing up in a city. I've also spent a lot of time in nature, and I felt like culturally, there wasn't really as many images, particularly of young Black children in nature, young Black boys in nature. So I kind of thought about that as something that I might bring into the project. I also knew that Richard Wright had done things, and like this book, 12 Million Black Voices, where he worked with the WPA images, I think, or the FSA images that existed, and put together a book using photography in his writing. So he had an interest in photography, both as a writer, and he also took photographs. So all those pieces were really part of what I wanted to do. And here, these are some other images. And so over the years, as I think photography has played a role for Black people in terms of representing in a positive light each other, and finding ways to show faces and to show people, Black people, in a positive light, and take control of those images. And so here we have the Crisis magazine, which was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, and every issue featured children, photographs of children in somewhere in the book. Here is a book from the 40s, My Dog Rinty, featuring, and it's just a story about a boy who adopts a dog. So an early photography book with young Black children. And here is Charles R. Smith's Langston Hughes' My People, which won the Coretta Scott King Award, which is just a beautiful book, kind of really featuring faces and people. So here are a few pages from Seeing Into Tomorrow. Just enough of snow for a boy's finger to write his name on the porch. So what I decided to do, in kind of thinking about Richard Wright's biography and wanting to show young Black boys in nature, was that while we have all these different children in the pictures, we're really kind of a little bit kind of reflecting back on his biography. One of the things that came from my first editorial meetings was that we would go through spring. So I started basically at winter and let us out through spring, and not doing the whole of the year and the seasons that are covered in the haiku. And here are just a few more. So insistently, a crow caws in a spring field that I want to look. And what I wanted to do was to make sure to show a range of skin tones and hair textures in my photographs of the children that I photographed. Here's my own son, Asa, who's now 14, and my father, who got to be a guest appearance, the only adult guest appearance in the book. Empty railroad tracks, the train sounds in the spring hills, and the rails leap with life. My father, of course, because of Freight Train, I felt that this was be nice to give a little homage there, and in back to the logic of real life, that the boy wouldn't be standing near a freight train on his own at this age. He was about 4. This was one of my favorite poems of the ones I chose, and one that, for the longest time was going to be the title. The title was going to be Each Green Leaf. But suddenly mindful, the tree was looking at me, each green leaf alive. And then I think I have the one last one here that was the title of the book. A spring sky so clear that you feel you are seeing into tomorrow. And this one, I think what we found as I continued to work on it, and one thing about this book and the Neighborhood Mother Goose and Neighborhood Sing-Along, is because I was working with all of these books, I was working with, each page was going to be a different poem, or in the Neighborhood Mother Goose and Sing-Along, there's sometimes more than one, but that each was kind of a different thought, which was very different from the first books I did and many of the books I've done, where you have a story that you're telling, where you have 24, 32 pages, what you were telling a thought through sequentially over time, right? Over the time of those pages. And so with each page, and it was really fun, particularly when I started on the Neighborhood Mother Goose, to think, oh, all I have, each page is its own thing, and then I can go somewhere else and I can do something else. And so creating all of these books, as I created them, I had a loose idea of somewhat of sequence, but I didn't really have the sequence figured out. And so in all of these books, one of the end parts of the project has been figuring out that sequence. And that's something that I work on. And I've talked with the editor and the art director on, we kind of like really figure out the sequence of things. This, once we kind of locked in on this poem, it became clear that this one was going to be the end of this sequence, and that it led us into kind of a really positive space about sort of future. So that was kind of became clear that that was the end. And obviously the one with the snow was going to be the beginning. So those two kind of locked in pretty easily, but that was sort of the general thing. All right, I have one more. I was going to talk a bit about A Girl Like Me. I don't know, do we want to do a couple more, another question, or what's?
Yeah, we have one more question, Nina, and then if you would talk about this book, it'd be great.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Students?
Sorry. Do you feel that your parents influence your art style? If so, how?
Yes, definitely. Well, you know, on the very basic level, my parents have always worked on books where they pretty much fill the whole page. They don't have borders with type. They don't do a single page piece of art with the words on the other side of the page. That the book is always one whole piece, and you kind of end up opening up the page and you are in those experiences, whatever they may be. And that was definitely something that I, you know, immediately gravitated to. I have on occasion, in some of the books I've done single pages and double page spreads, and also used blank pages with just the type on it. But that was definitely something that has always been part of my thinking about books overall. Generally, is I gravitate towards the double page spread. So but of course you also have to make sure that your text is concise enough that you can fit everything. You know, you don't have to take so much room for the other things to happen in the spread. So that's definitely something that's very much of them. I feel my mother, you know, also spent a lot of time with books sort of kind of really that were meditations on childhood and about children's experiences. So I feel like that came through a bit in what I do. And then just sort of, I think they both, and my father in particular, just sort of really, you know, use the whole frame, filled the picture with stuff. And it's interesting because I look at other artists and art, there's a lot more space, a lot more white space or blank space, or that your protagonist is further away. And that's definitely a different way of looking at things, or sort of more muted colors. All of those things are things that other people do, but I feel like I came through sort of a different kind of a point of view that was much more sort of about sort of graphic shapes and things really filling up that whole space, that space for the picture. So that would be some ways I'd say we're similar. All right. Okay, so A Girl Like Me.
Nina, one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Is your sister also an artist?
My sister she is a, by trade, she is a landscape architect. So she designs gardens and the spaces around buildings and all those kinds of things. And she also is a jewelry maker and designer, and is a crafter extraordinaire, knitter, weaver, any other number of kind of craft projects. So she did not enter the book business, but she's incredibly talented and creative. All right, so A Girl Like Me. So A Girl Like Me, you know, this will be another book that came really through conversation. So after I finished working on Seeing Into Tomorrow, Carol Hintz and I were talking about ideas, and she said, well, did you think about maybe you want to do a book that kind of celebrates African-American girls, poetry and the girls? Got, you know, Seeing Into Tomorrow kind of fits that boy box. And what about the girls? And so I thought, well, you know, give this some thought, and spent a couple of months on a delightful deep read of African-American women poets from Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote her poems in 1757, I think was her first poems written, was a slave in Boston, through to Nikki Giovanni and let's see, Angelina Grimke. I'm just sort of all over the map, any number of things. And I came up with this really lovely collection of poems that I thought, well, this is more than will fit in a book, more than we possibly need, but I'm going to just send it to you anyway. Included in that was this poem by Angela Johnson called A Girl Like Me. And it had been published, I think in 2006 or so, in a collection for young girls, middle grade collection of poems. And I thought it was lovely and fun and threw that in there. When I finally heard back from Lerner and from Carol, she said, well, we were thinking, what would you think about just making a book with this one poem? And, I had to give it a beat because while I love the poem and I see exactly why this was appealing and what could work about it, I also thought, well, how am I going to show the girl in the underwear? I knew I didn't have to think about that part. If I was just doing a single image for this poem, I could do some other part of the poem. I wouldn't have to think about that underwear question. Anyway, so that was my own little logic worry headspace that I went into. But I thought about it some, and I did some drawing. And as one of the things that came to my mind as I thought about it was that I didn't have to be limited, even though it said I didn't have to be limited to just a single character, that this first person voice, I could do more with that. I could actually do what I ended up doing, which was 3 first person voices to begin this poem, because it's non-specific, right? And so I have the opportunity, because there's these different moments in the way the poem's structured, where she's first flying, having this dream about flying in her underwear, in her Supergirl underwear, way up high. And next she's climbing tall buildings. And third, she's in the water. And so I thought, well, these 3 moments could be broken out into 3 separate people, and it will flow, it will work. So that was my first sort of revelation. And so what I did was, pencil and paper, these little sketches, walk through basically just about the whole poem here. The first page didn't fit on this page here, and what that could possibly look like and be. So here's the beginning. I always dream, and this was my dummy for the book. So, when I work on things, I always print out my dummies too. And I have this one is pretty much done just on tabloid size paper, because as I'm working on things, when I'm working in the computer, I don't see everything that I see when I take it out and I print it out and look at it by hand. And sort of the experience of the book we're going to read, we're always going to read a book in front of us, not on the computer, or at least not yet on the computer. So actually printing it out and turning the page makes a difference. But so we have 3 different girls. One will have frizzy hair, one will have tight hair curled up, and one will have little puffs. That's sort of my first thought. The background elements were things I started playing with early on. And what I knew I wanted to do was make this feel really collagey, and the dream sequence, I had room to play. And then again, as I said, realize, okay, each one's going to be doing these different things. I'm going to have to work around the underwear and not have to show her underwear, but that's fine. And I'll have her flying. When I thought about place, I actually was looking at some photographs I had from upstate New York, because I didn't really want to make it specifically my city. I wanted to make it city in a general way, so it could be a lot of places, and broaden that out from the specifics of where I live. And then she climbs the buildings, and then there's the swimmer. It's fun with working on the dummy. I sort of end up putting a lot of time into these pieces that are actually, obviously not going to be what the finished book is. With this, because I was developing these shapes, and I actually did end up finding a way to sort of use this as a really good template for the finished images. But of course, the children that I photograph, I don't draw them, I photograph them. So the drawings are always just really placeholders. And here's sort of a direct line between the two for this page. So a lot of stuff shows up as it does here. I used the same background piece, which was a ceiling that I photographed in Spain. These lines here became really for the water became sort of a template for me to build this, though this changed quite a bit. And then these elements were created, shapes that you can generate in Photoshop, patterns in Photoshop, and shapes in Photoshop that were combined in, as well as, you know, splatters and stuff like that, things that I added into the picture. In the photograph of my cousin's daughter, Sydney. So all of those pieces kind of are things that were in this book pretty well thought out, which isn't always the case for me. Sometimes I find that I'm figuring things out a lot more through the act of photographing and then putting what I end up with kind of, but in this case, I was actually able to figure out a lot of pieces ahead of time. The next part of the story was the biggest question for me after I figured out the first part. And of course, pretty much anybody will tell you that dream images are going to be really fun to illustrate, right? There's a lot of freedom creatively, you can do kind of what you want. And the first thing I thought was, well, in order to have this story move forward, what is it going to be? What happens in real life? What is when she resolves that she's going to, then the next part of the poem is to bring her dreams to life? What makes it exciting? What's going to be exciting visually? And I thought about community, and I thought about her friends. And this was just something that I was also thinking about in, you know, volunteering at my son's school and being around children and seeing that they work collaboratively in classrooms. And I was thinking that, you know, what will be next is that if you bring your dreams, your joy, your self, your true self to your friends, you are bringing something, a gift to everybody else. And that's something you're all sharing in. And that sharing is exciting, right? That sharing is what you do as a creative person, sharing yourself with somebody else, and that excites them to share themselves, right? So that's what kind of came next. Oh, here's the cat, the loud cat that maybe you guys hear. I don't know what you hear, but there she is. She's pretty, but she's annoying sometimes. So anyway, so the girls do this and then end up at the ocean, which is where the poem ends. So the last lines before this are, because a girl like me always needs to be thinking way up high and making everything better than the dream. And everything, our dreams are made best usually through our community, right? So that's where the book ended up. The last thing I did in this book, which was a fun kind of departure from other stuff I did, and also kind of was inspired by being around children in a way that I, you know, hadn't been before, where, you know, just thinking about how do I get them sort of feeling more directly engaged in the story. And so to do that, I said, well, let me ask all these girls a few questions about themselves. This is a good opportunity for them to share a little bit about themselves. So they all were given a questionnaire, and I chose various answers that they had given me and put together a little like blurb for each of them. And then did review them with them, because by the time I actually had this page figured out, it was about a year later. So there were a few favorite colors that changed, a few things that kids wanted to edit, because, you know, of course they're kids. And of course you don't necessarily have the same beliefs about what it is that your favorite animal is when you're 6 to when you're 7. So those things changed, and that became the very end of the book, and a space. This isn't actually what's in the book itself, is a space here which says, what about a kid like you? All right, so that's kind of what I've been doing so far. I'm going to just show one more piece to you, which is one of the things coming next. And this is a big departure for me. So I have been for a number of years kind of thinking about the idea of working on something that was less photographic. And next year we'll have 2 projects come out that will be created digitally, but based through drawing, and then maybe in this one a little bit of photography into the background elements in the pictures. This one that I wrote, I'm Not Small, and then another a biography of Shirley Chisholm by Tamika Fryer Brown that will also come out next year too. All right, so that's what I've brought to share. We have other questions or anything?
Yeah. Do you photograph for fun sometimes? And if yes, what do you like to photograph?
Yes, I absolutely do photograph for fun. Aside from, of course, photographing family kind of a little bit obsessively, one of the things, sort of fun things that I've been doing in the last year or so has been kind of very focused on plants and flowers, and, just sort of taking those photographs of flowers and again, manipulating them and playing with them a little bit more, and playing, just sort of working with the color and adding extra textures and patterns and stuff to them. So that's something I do. When I travel, I always take lots of pictures too. That's always something that kind of is just sort of part of how I experience being in a new place, I think, is to take photographs. So yeah, a camera comes with me quite a lot when I'm walking around places.
Thank you. And one last one that came in. So you talked a lot about collaboration and working with other people. Have you considered collaborating with Lin-Manuel Miranda to do a Hamilton book?
No, but do you know? Sounds great. No. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I think as I don't know if anybody has mentioned this, but usually when you work on a book as an illustrator, you get a project and somebody else is the author. The project comes through editor, so you actually don't really collaborate that directly. But in a way, you actually always are collaborating, because if you have somebody else's words in front of you, or actually then, pulling from what it is you understand from what they've given you, right? So, with Angela Johnson, with the book, A Girl Like Me, I didn't know what she thought about it until it was finished. And it was like, I kind of wrote her a note and she talked about how much she liked it to me. And I was so relieved. But, we all receive stuff in ways that are based on who we are and where we come from and what our thinking is. So we kind of put that back out there. So those are collaborations I usually do that aren't so direct. But it would be interesting to do a collaboration where you actually were like talking back and forth, maybe one day in some way.
Yeah. What is your hope for the impact that your books make?
I love the idea that a book gives a kid a sense of belonging and being part of the world, and having a story of their own to tell. Like if it inspires a child to say, oh, this story means that I can tell another story. And that kind of leads forward to each child telling another story based out of their own experiences. So that a book sort of just opens up that door to storytelling and to language for kids.
What was the biggest challenge from moving from photography to digital images?
Drawing and confidence, I'd say. So I have used drawing for years, as a part of my process, but to lead with drawing was something that I was not very confident about in my thinking about doing this. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth about what the images should look like and what the drawing should be. And then finally moved away from actual pencil and paper and moved into kind of designing and working with color and form. And then finally found that my confidence, once I realized that what I was making, even though it was based out of drawing, still felt like the same person that I was when I was working on The Neighborhood Mother Goose or on One Hot Summer Day. And once I kind of felt that sort of grounded back in the same, that this was all just an extension of the same way of seeing, that I felt enough confidence to really get going. And then, the drawings, and I'm not small, I've worked on so many times. I just keep redrawing it and going like, well, that's not right, and all that kind of stuff. But
Well, that is all the questions. If anyone else has any questions, now's the time. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing with us, and we will then
Nina.
stop.
Yeah, Nina, thank you so very much for this opportunity to hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. We just thank you for your sharing and watching your work and the different styles and the transitions you have made and how you create has been just a joy to hear today, and we thank you for that. It's also been nice to hear you mentioning wonderful names in the world of picture books over the years, Susan Hirschman and many others, the Pinkneys, just wonderful individuals that I'm sure all have been a wonderful influence on you and the work that you create, and we thank you for sharing that. And we look forward to the work that the works that are coming yet in the future, and we appreciate you stepping in. Nina was scheduled for a few years down the road, and one of our illustrators this weekend was having great difficulty with Zoom, the whole technology from where she lives. And so Nina was gracious enough to step in and be a part of this weekend's conference, and we thank you so very much.
Well, thank you. It has really been a delight and a pleasure. And, I've just loved hearing from everybody and hearing all of the speakers, and you guys, your students, you've all been doing a wonderful job with the moderating and with all of your questions and the introduction. So thank you. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. If I could just a few last bit announcements and comments. I wanted to thank a few people, the illustrators and authors that we have had this weekend. I keep saying that it may be the best ever. And I think that is always true. Each one is so different, but yet so alike in many different ways. And we just thank you for coming together, even in a virtual format, to make this a very, very special resource for us and all of the folks that are with us this weekend. I want to thank Dr. Carrie Teeple and her class. You've added so much to this weekend's conference. We appreciate the profession that you are going into, and know that I would be proud to have any of you teaching in a school system that would have my son or daughter. So we thank you for your commitment to the profession. The volunteers, many of them were here today for a watch party and last night. We thank you for being a part of that. And the Maz Museum staff could not do anything that we do without the staff that we have, as well as the volunteers. So thank all of you. And the credit, for those that are taking it for credit, just a short meeting after everyone goes off of this Zoom. But we thank each and every one of you that attended last night and today. We appreciate the work that you do, taking these resources and sharing them with students, adults, anyone that has a love in the art of picture books. So we thank you. We look forward to you coming back, whatever format it may be in, but we just appreciate your continued support of the Maz Museum, and wishing you all the best during this holiday season that's upon us and the winter months ahead. Please take care, be safe, and we hope to see you soon. Bye now.